So welcome to our question and answer webinar. And today it's just an informal time for you to drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. We should be able to see them in either place. And we will give you our best answer. And please, if you would like to respond to what we're saying in the chat with another question, we'll just be watching for that as we proceed through the webinar. So I believe we have some questions to begin that Julie and I thought of that are commonly asked by people.
Yes, one common question if you're new to Piano Safari is just an overview of the ages that it's designed for. The children's series, the main Piano Safari method, the 3 levels, are designed to begin with students ages 6 through about 10. And then we released Piano Safari for the older student, which is designed for beginning students ages about 10 through adult. So those are our 2 main series. And then we also have some supplemental books. So if you like using a different method, there are ways to incorporate Piano Safari materials in with the supplemental books, such as Animal Adventures, which is our technique from level 1, and pattern pieces, which are rote pieces from levels 1 and 2. So those work really well with any method. And Pam has sent us some questions by email ahead of time, so I just wanted to read one of those. She had a question about how we work with the technique pieces, how long the students keep the technique, and when we pass them. So Katie, did you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Sure, yes. So of course the answer to this is somewhat dependent on your student, how long they will stay on a technique, of course. But in general, we focus on the technique within the unit. We like to work within the unit with all components. So the reading pieces, rote pieces, technique, and improvisation. So within a unit, we have 3 components of each technique. We have the technical exercise, we have an improvisation that uses that technique, and then we also have a rote piece that uses that technique. So typically at the beginning of the unit, I like to introduce the technique, and then they're going to be refining that and working on it as they are doing everything else within that unit of the book. We proceed through level 1 this way, and I like to incorporate some days of review also. So a fun thing to do if you have all of the stuffed animals, we don't sell these, but you kind of have to go on a treasure hunt and collect them yourself. If you have a stuffed animal for each animal technique, you could, for example, put them like in a basket or a bag, and the student pulls out one and has to review that technique. So that can be a fun way to bring back a technique that they had done before and have them refine it in a new way. And also throughout Piano Safari, we have built in opportunities to review techniques in higher levels. So in level 2, we use the animal techniques again in more sophisticated ways. So if your student doesn't completely master the technique, you feel like they should move on, don't worry, it will come back and you can have another chance to work on that in another context.
Also, one of the things that I wanted to add on to Katie's answer there is she mentioned that Piano Safari is a unit-based approach. So you notice in the book that in the upper corner there's what unit you're in, and the book correlates with the sight reading cards that are in that unit, and we really want the student to master the entire unit before they graduate to the next unit. But within a unit, you can assign the pieces in any order. So if your student needs another reading piece that week, you can assign that, or if they need a rote piece, you can skip around within the unit. So if they're working on the technique exercise, the rote piece that goes with that technique exercise, and the improvisation piece that go with that technique exercise, you can spread those 3 things out throughout the entire unit. So that really reviews the technique as they go along as well. One of the ways that we like to have students develop the assignment is to use page marking tabs. I don't know how I ever lived without these things, but I taught for many years not even knowing about these until I had a little student who was 6 years old, and she didn't have much help at home with practicing. And so she could not find the page number for her pieces in her books. And I discovered this at the lesson when I gave her the book and asked her to open to a piece, and she couldn't find the page number. And I realized that she wasn't making much progress because just simply she didn't know how to find the page number. And so these page marking tabs are wonderful for that, because then she could easily open the book and find the right page to practice. And we have various colors that the student chooses. So perhaps green would be the pieces that they're working on. And then once they're really good at playing the piece, we ask them if they'd like to keep it for review. And if they do, then we take off the green and put on a blue tab or whatever color they choose, so that they have some review pieces they're working on. And then if they have one coming up for a recital, we pick a different color to mark that, so that you can easily see how many working on pieces, review pieces, and recital pieces there are that they're working on in their book. So that's just one of the ways that we manage the assignment.
And also, going back to the technique question, how long do you keep a technique exercise? If you want them to continue to review a particular technique and you are using this tab system, you could keep a technique color tab, and they could go back to the previous units even if they've moved on. So we have a couple other questions we prepared, but again, if you are joining us for the webinar today, please drop any questions that you have in the chat or the Q&A section so we can answer those here in a moment.
Yeah, questions on any Piano Safari subject you would like. We'd love to answer them. Another question that Pam had was, she asked, have you tried incorporating Sally Cathcart's new books? Would one of the activities be just one of the things we do in a lesson? So if you haven't seen these books yet, they're called Ready to Play, and they're written by Sally Cathcart, who's a colleague in England, and she's a specialist in musicianship and music education. And so these are designed for students to sing and then have a keyboard component, but mostly it's solfege and singing. So Catherine and I, we currently don't have any young students to try these books out on, but we look forward to doing that. And yes, you could just take one of the songs that she gives and just do that as a small portion of the lesson, and then review that song in subsequent lessons, because those songs are really, they lend themselves to reviewing week after week, so the student gets comfortable with them. So let's see, what's another question here? One question we often get is, one just popped up. When do the students stop using non-legato technique? Alicia asked that.
So that's a great question. And, you know, officially in the book, they learn in repertoire book 1, they learn the tree frog legato in unit 4. So definitely up to that moment, you will be doing all non-legato up to that point. And, you know, even past that point, if you feel like a student's playing legato and they're not able to control it technically, non-legato technique is such an important thing to return to and continue to refine and use throughout their first several years of study. And of course, as we know, as advanced pianists, I teach non-legato technique in things like Bach conventions and advanced repertoire. So it's a technique that you will use throughout your pianistic career.
The non-legato was a big revelation in my dissertation research, because all the teachers that I interviewed, who are well known for their excellent teaching, they all emphasize starting students by playing non-legato. And the reason for that is for 2 reasons. One is because that's the best way to form the piano hand. It's actually quite difficult to play legato and keep a good piano hand shape for beginners. So non-legato is definitely the easiest articulation. And also the other reason is because on our modern pianos, the action is really heavy. And so if you have a very small student with a very light arm, playing non-legato will allow them to use the arm to produce good tone. So even if a little 4-year-old, they can play a good, strong tone on the piano if they're using their arm. So that really helps them develop a loose and reliable technique. And we found that when we have our students play non-legato for the first half of book 1, that they become fearless at the piano. They have great aim, and they can get really good sound out of the piano. So that's why we do that.
It looks like we have another question here. What was your favorite part about Piano Safari when you were in the beginning stages of creating it? What is your favorite part now? That's such a fun question. So going back to the very beginning stages of Piano Safari, Julie and I met at the University of Oklahoma, and she was there working on her PhD, and I was working on my master's degree in piano performance and pedagogy, and we both came in the same year, and met right at the beginning of the year, and quickly found that we both had this dream of writing a piano method. So in our early days, we would have method meetings, we'd call it, because it wasn't Piano Safari yet, it didn't have a name. We always had to have coffee, and we began putting our ideas down on paper. So the thing that we quickly found out is it's one thing to have pedagogical ideas, and it's another thing to put it down on paper in a way that's meaningful and easy to understand by other people. So it took us 10 years to write our first level in a way that we were happy with, and we felt like would be useful to other teachers who could just pick it up and kind of understand where we were coming from. So my favorite part of that, it's such a wonderful thing to have a colleague where you can just share time with and debate these pedagogical ideas, because it makes you grow yourself. Because not only are you talking through things and understanding them in a different way because you're talking through it, you have someone else to bounce ideas off of, and you can bring these ideas together to create something great. What would you say, Julie?
Yeah, it was providential that we met in the same year in pedagogy class, and that we had such similar ideas. And if we disagreed and couldn't come to an agreement, we would just say, well, let's think about that. And then we would think about it some more and revisit it. The second part of Christy's question was, what is our favorite part now? And I know that my favorite part is seeing how many students around the world use Piano Safari, and love it, and how many teachers tell us that their students just love piano because of it. And also, like, realizing that we have so many more ideas that there's really never an end to the materials that we could keep writing. So we have more and more ideas all the time, and it's just a matter of how are we going to find the time to put all our ideas down on paper. So it's just been really fun. Like, it's such a huge part of our lives now, and the idea that it came from nowhere, and I don't know,
it still surprises us, right?
Yeah, it was. Alicia had a follow-up to the non-legato question. She says, should level 2 students continue to use non-legato in any note without a slur? And I would say yes, for the most part. We might have missed a slur here and there, but generally, yes. If it doesn't have a slur, it should be played non-legato. And the technique exercises from level 1, the 7 animal techniques, do come around in a more difficult form in level 2 again, so that they can keep working on that non-legato and their good hand shape and their firm fingertips and the legato. Because as Katie mentioned, as advanced pianists, we use legato, non-legato, staccato, all the different articulations. So they're all important. It's just we found that non-legato is the easiest one for students to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an example in level 2 of a mixture of non-legato and legato would be like a challenge piece by Reinagel. So, for example, so in that piece, the slurs and the non-legato notes are clearly marked. And throughout the book, we did try to do that, yes.
And that's one of the reasons we call that one a challenge piece, is because there are certain spots where one hand will be detached and the other hand has a slur. So that's a really important coordination for them to master in these early level classical pieces, so that when they eventually play Bach, they'll already have that coordination built in. I know my first Bach piece was a Bach invention, Bach inventions. I didn't play any minuets, and it was kind of difficult to jump into the inventions. So all the preparation with articulation that you can do will help students as they progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually teach more advanced students now, some transfer students who did not have early training in articulation, and one in particular is playing a Bach invention, and it was one of the hardest things for her to learn to do, even though she was such an adept reader and could handle it hands separately very well. Just the combination of switching back and forth between mixed articulations was challenging because she had never encountered it. So it is a priority that we've made in Piano Safari that students would have early training with that.
Yes, and in book one, we really train the students to be able to play non-legato and legato on command. So play with the tall giraffe technique, that's the non-legato, or can you play that with tree frog, which is a legato with an arm bounce on each note, or can you play that with soaring bird, which is a longer 3-note slur, so that they can play any of those ways on command. And I don't think you mentioned, we have this game at the beginning of level 2 when they're playing Safari Friends, and they learn all the sections of Safari Friends, and then we put all our stuffed animals in a bag, and they pull one out and play that portion of Safari Friends, like the tree frog section, and then they get to throw the stuffed animal at their parents. So they always love that game, and it really helps them to reinforce, like, tree frog, legato, this is how it feels. Tall giraffe, non-legato, this is how it feels. I get to throw it at my mom, which is, of course, their favorite part. So that's a fun activity in the beginning of level 2. Which brings me to another question that Pam sent in. She said, are there other things not included in the books themselves that we regularly do to bring your students to a higher level? So I think mostly we've designed Piano Safari to be very inclusive. So most of the information is in the books, but of course, as teachers, we all come up with different ideas for teaching each piece or concept or reinforcing it. I'm a big fan of flashcards of various types, so I like to make flashcards for my students of different things like dynamics, so they can match up the dynamic level with the Italian term and the English term, just various kinds of flashcards. And then we can play games with stuffed animals if they're young. So Katie, do you have any other thoughts on fun activities?
This kind of made me think of the question people also ask about, do we supplement? Which
right,
is the question. Yeah. So in level 1, I typically say no. And the reason is do not supplement, because the reading approach is so specific that it's difficult to find other reading material that would correspond with the reading approach. And of course, like at that stage, you don't want to confuse students with a whole variety of approaches. You could supplement level 1 with some additional rote pieces. However, with that said, there are quite a good number of rote pieces in level 1, so I've never felt like I need to look for extra material for a student. But I would say if you supplement in level 1, it should be a rote piece or possibly something really specific like a Christmas piece or something seasonal. In level 2, that's an easier point to start supplementing because students learn how to find all of the notes on the grand staff, and then they begin to learn all of their intervals, seconds through fifths, I should say, not all of the intervals. But if they can play intervals seconds through fifths and start anywhere on the grand staff, it's very easy to pull in other material from other supplemental series for special recital pieces or specific things like, popular songs or Disney songs or something that a student might want to play. It's easier to add into level 2 and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also don't really supplement in level 1. And in level 2, I often don't, unless I feel like the student needs extra practice at reading different fonts, because our books have specific fonts or specific textures. So like one of my students right now really wanted to play some Halloween pieces, so I got him a Halloween book. One of the books I often use to supplement level 2 is Just Imagine Book 1 by Martha Muir. I've loved that book for years. It has a clown on the cover. Let's see if I can. Yes, this one. Mm-hmm. I've also, with another student who just needed more positional practice with reading, used Jane McGraw's Masterwork Classics Duets, both book 1 and 2, which has student duets with teacher accompaniments. I like using that book. And then in level 3, there's much more you can supplement with. But we purposely taught our students Piano Safari strictly on its own for several years to make sure that it would work standing alone without supplementation. And so we often do that as well, since the books are quite long, and so each level is a year or more of curriculum for the average student. So you don't really need to supplement unless the student has a specific interest in a certain piece.
Looks like we have another question in the Q&A section. So this says, I love your animal techniques. They're so good at helping students develop good technique from the beginning. You don't have a specific animal technique for staccato. How do you teach it? Finger staccato, wrist staccato, arm staccato, or something else that's specific to Piano Safari? You want to talk about that one, Julie?
Sure. Staccato actually does come up occasionally in level 1 in the rote pieces. And actually, if you think about the kangaroo technique, at that brisk tempo, it ends up being staccato. So they are sort of playing staccato, and it would be from the forearm. We want the forearm to be one playing mechanism, so they don't start doing any weird stuff with their wrist in the staccato. And in the tree frog, they do use some wrist, so they are involving the wrist, but on that specific exercise, just the forearm. And then they're introduced to the symbol of the staccato dot at the beginning of level 2 in the Prairie Dog Companion. So then they're seeing it, and it's usually not hard for them to play at all since they're so good with their technique from level 1, just to make sure that they're bouncing. It's just a little bit of a shorter non-legato.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to demonstrate at the piano. So if you were playing non-legato technique just with a pentascale. So there you see me using my forearm, and I'm not doing very much to articulate with my fingertip at all, versus the grasshopper staccatos that we introduced in level 2. I'm still going to use some forearm, but I'm just using a quicker finger action. But it's not that we want them to freeze their arm like this at all. And we also don't want them to play from the wrist. Not like that. So we just think of it as a quicker release and faster finger action.
Yes. So basically in level 1, we set up the large motions with the basic gestures. And then as they go through levels 2 and 3, we refine that more and more down to the finger level. So they're having more finger action and more variation in how they play things. But that's all set up in level 1.
Mm-hmm.
So Pam had another question. She said she loves the first and second books especially, and the students and parents are so happy and acknowledge their rapid progress. And she feels like she should start introducing note names a little bit earlier than level 2, and she likes to do it in level 1. And I'll have to say, Pam, that I've started doing that as well. So the basic way of reading in Piano Safari that we believe produces the greatest percentage of students who are good readers is the intervallic approach. Catherine and I both taught from the music tree method before we wrote Piano Safari. We also taught from all the other methods too. We tried them all out. And we found that with our students who had been in the music tree, that intervallic approach really helped them become a confident reader. So that's why we chose the intervallic approach to reading when we sat down to write Piano Safari. However, we do recognize, and we did this because I'm sure you've all had students before who you found out were reading note by note. That note's a C, that one's a D, that one's an E, without ever realizing that those notes go up in a row. So you don't really have to read the note name of all of them. Some students just naturally see the larger patterns, but others don't, and they need to be taught that. So that's why we think the intervallic approach is good, because it groups music into phrases, which advanced pianists do read that way. We see shapes of the melodies, we see shapes of chords, and then we also, of course, see all the note names underneath those larger groups. So we start the students with the intervallic approach, and then, of course, absolutely, they need to learn all their note names on the staff. So it's just a matter of when you decide to start that. And officially, we start that at the beginning of level 2 and show them the skips alphabet so that they can learn how the staves relate to each other and all the notes on the staff. And then you have to go back and review over and over so that they become very automatic at being able to name the note and play it in the correct octave. which I found takes a very long time for some students, most students. Some of them pick it up right away and others need much more practice. So in early next year, we'll be releasing some note name flashcards, and we'll probably do a webinar or a blog post about how to use those, so that we can have something to start just helping students become automatic at that note recognition. So you can start that in mid book 1 with just recognizing a few notes on the staff, or you can wait until book 2. Every teacher does it differently.
Yes. So another question that we get often is about transfer students and how specifically to transfer students into Piano Safari to find out where they fit. So of course, this is not a one-size-fits-all answer, but there are a few common recommendations that we like to give. If the student is in a level 1 book or like a primer level, we usually say just to start over again at the beginning of repertoire book 1, because it's such a different approach, not only in the reading approach, but also in the fact that students are learning these specific techniques and they're learning rote pieces. And that is unique to Piano Safari and is not incorporated into other beginning level methods. So we have found that students don't feel like they're moving backward. They're usually just excited to have a new book, and then the rote pieces in particular feel much more difficult to them than some early level reading pieces and other primer levels. Julie, do you want to talk a bit about how to transfer in maybe a student who's had more background than that?
Sure, but following up on what you said, also the sight reading cards are always new to students coming from another method. So that's another thing that's new. So they really don't feel like they're going back. I always try to err on the side of caution, even if they've had 2 years of piano, depending on their age and how they're doing, it might be good to put them back in level 1 and just move quickly through the things that they're already good at, or skip a few pieces here and there. I had one student who was 7, and she came to me after 3 years of piano. So she did start when she was 4. Yikes. But she really did need to start over in level 1 and learn all the techniques and learn all the reading, and she had never played rote pieces before. And so she just flew through level 1, and she was so excited because she's like, I'm so good at piano, this is so easy. So I think with children that young, they're not going to feel like they're going backwards. They're just going to feel like they're really good at piano and they can move so quickly. With older students, it's a little more tricky. Depending on their age, you could put them in level 2 and then review the animal techniques from level 1 with the Animal Adventures book, which is the excerpts of the technique exercises from level 1. Also, I always put all my transfer students through all the sight reading cards beginning on the staff if they're ready to skip the pre-staff. And I'll just test them usually at the interview with the sight reading cards, starting very easy, even if they've had years of lessons, so that I can see how they read, whether they know their note names and intervals. And even when I taught college, I was always surprised that a college freshman coming in who had had 10 years of piano, some might struggle with reading a simple level 2 or 3 piece. So we can never take it for granted that their reading level is going to be where it should be. So it's always good to err on the side of caution with the sight reading cards too, and work up from there.
So it looks like we have another question. It says, when teaching Lion Paw arm drops in book 1, especially for the note that's 2 octaves away from the starting note, I find that little children aren't able to do well by just leaning over as an older student would do, teachers or adults. So I now let them get right off the piano bench, as it seems to work better at this beginning stage. Any comments on this? So the Lion Paw exercise would start the right hand on middle D, right in front of you. It moves up. So we have about a 2 octave range for the student. I would say that it's not wrong to stand at all, especially if the student is the appropriate height. So you want their forearm parallel to the floor. If they're standing and that's the case, then I don't see why that wouldn't work. Now, I did find a nice suggestion when I observed Mary Craig Powell, who's a Suzuki teacher, years ago, and she told her students, rather than leaning over to the side, to actually lean diagonally into the either top or bottom corner, depending on which direction you're leaning. Because if you lean over directly to the side, it actually feels a little bit unbalanced. Versus if you lean diagonally, it gives you more arm to align properly behind the note without feeling like you're going to fall off the side of the bench. Julie, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I often have my little ones stand if they're 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 years old, until they get too tall to stand at the beginning lessons, the very beginning. And because some of the pieces do move around, like King of the African Drum is all in the low, and they do have to move a little bit, or Crocodile in the Nile, they're moving over the entire keyboard. So that would be fine to stand up. If you do have them sit down and they're playing one of the techniques, each technique exercise is just for one hand and then the other hand. So if they're sitting, you want to make sure that you move the bench so they're centered in front of the octaves that they'll be playing on. And then they won't fall off the bench either.
Which some students might want to do kind of dramatically. But let's see if there's any other questions. Not yet. Feel free to drop any in there in response to anything we've said. But another one that I thought of that I frequently hear in our Teaching Piano Safari group from teachers is, how do I motivate reluctant improvisers? Because improvising is something that we do incorporate from the beginning of Piano Safari. And we deliberately design these improvisations to be hopefully unintimidating for both the teacher and the student. So in terms of, for the teacher, we actually provide an accompaniment part for you, and also really specific instructions for the student. Like one of our first improvisations, March improvisation, has a written out teacher accompaniment, and then the student, the only direction is improvise on the black keys using any rhythm, right? So hopefully like these really specific parameters that we included will help students feel less intimidated. I think sometimes just saying, make up anything with no parameters is a little bit too overwhelming for many people. So Julie, do you have any other ideas? I have never personally had a student who was really scared to improvise, but I know that exists.
Yeah, I've had a few children, and most of them are very eager improvisers and will just go at the piano very enthusiastically. If you make it like, now we're going to make up a piece, you just play the black keys and I'm going to play this, ready, go, and you just jump in and they do it. But if they are reticent, like in the March improv, while you're playing the accompaniment, you can just have them say, I want you to play just this note. And just tell them exactly what to play. And then the next time say, can you find a couple different notes? Or before you improvise, you can play some patterns. So you play, and then they copy. And then another pattern. So that once they have an idea of a few patterns in their hand, then while you're playing the accompaniment, they can just play those. But this is one of the light bulb moments of the past however many years we've been doing this. That was one of the most exciting things ever, is the connection between teaching rote pieces and improvisation. Because we found that students who learn the rote pieces, because they're so pattern-based and make sense, the patterns are based on keyboard patterns that make sense to the children, they just adopt those patterns, and they were over and over again coming and saying, I made up a piece, and playing compositions that were clearly based on the patterns from their rote pieces. So I grew up never improvising, never even gave it a thought, no interest on my part in improvising at all. And so this was a surprise to me when my Piano Safari students started coming in saying they had created their own music, because the students I had before Piano Safari very rarely did that. So most children, if you present it in a happy way, will gladly improvise as long as you don't criticize the improvisation. So at the beginning, whatever they play is great. And then if they start bringing in compositions, you could write them down for them, or eventually help them notate it once they get older. I have one student right now who's in high school, and he really wanted to learn to make up his own arrangement of We Three Kings, because last year he played the arrangement in Joy of Christmas Book 3, and he just loved it so much. And it's based on that. So I'm helping him come up with ideas, and then I'm putting it on in finale for him, because he can play a lot of very complicated things that doesn't quite have the patience to put it down on paper yet. So
Julie did this for my son when he was 4 years old, and he was doing these really awesome improvisations, but they were very difficult to transcribe, weren't they, Julie? Yeah, but he was so thrilled when he saw his piece printed out, and it looked so official. Okay, we do have a couple other questions, like here in the Q&A. This is from Pam. Related to what you just talked about with position at the piano, my young students' wrists are so flexible, it doesn't worry them nearly as much as it worries me when they bend their wrists like an L, like this. How do you encourage good arm and hand alignment in the upper and lower registers? I think good arm alignment first, begins with make sure that they're able to do it directly in front of them. So if so, then they should be able to do it in the higher and lower registers. If they kind of do what I was mentioning earlier, leaning in a diagonal way. So this gives so much more arm. I don't know if you can see here. So here's this. If I was not leaning, my arm is not aligned at all. If I lean diagonally, I can actually get all the way up here to the high note with my elbow and arm still in alignment behind my hand. So that definitely does a lot.
Yeah, and also alignment basically is this way. You want to avoid this or this kind of twisting of the wrist. The hand should be lined up pretty well all the time. In terms of too much wrist flexibility, as long as they're having good, strong finger joints and look coordinated, I wouldn't worry too much about the wrist. This is one of the reasons why we do emphasize the forearm first, so they don't get like really crazy with the wrist. But also often children will go through phases too, where they're just experimenting with their wrist and then they settle back down again. So I hope that answers the question, but the main alignment is this one, so that they're not twisting either way, because that's what gives you injury. So they should really stay, the arm carries the hand to wherever they're playing.
It can be good just to do that as a warm-up exercise with students when they're sitting down to check their height and their posture, and also then their alignment. You can practice that where if they just put their hand in a good piano hand shape right in front of them, and then let's say they slide up, we don't want it to look like this, right? They can learn to lean and adjust. I just think building this kind of thing in to every lesson, it only takes probably 30 seconds to warm up with that, and it can go along with checking the sitting position also.
Alicia had a follow-up to the Lion Paw. She is wondering about the what to do with the wrist in the Lion Paw, and if you could demonstrate, since you're sitting at the piano in the correct way. With the Lion Paw, the wrist does go down lower than you would in normal playing, just because we want to exaggerate that motion so that they can find their arm weight. So it's all about the weight of the arm. So the wrist will go down lower than in other exercises.
Sorry, my head's cut off, but that's not the important thing. All right, so in slow motion, first I would have a student start like this. This is obviously slow motion, but this is how loose they should be. All right, their fingertip is looking down to the note that it's going to drop on. So then we come in, they're dropping, but in slow motion, they're just descending. When their fingertip touches the key depresses and the wrist follows through. So you want to time that correctly so that like the drop doesn't happen before the note depresses, for example, or after. You want it to be a coordinated drop. Do you have anything to add to that, Julie?
Yeah, and for some students, they get that right away, and other ones might take a little bit more practice with the coordination. So it doesn't have to look perfectly at the first lesson like that. If a student really can't drop on finger 2, at the first or second lesson, we let them drop with their whole hand. Just the goal is to let them feel the weight of their arm. And they really like doing that because it makes a really loud sound, which will
demonstrate that
now. So that they feel the whole hand, just to feel that arm.
To feel falling with weight, and we don't want them to be hitting. So the goal of that exercise is literally just to get the falling with gravity and with a loose arm. So students like this because you know, their parents are like, start practicing, and they're like, I am practicing, my teacher told me to do that.
And then the next step, the next week might be if they have that loose arm but they can't connect like the right finger to the right key, to take a page marking tab and put it on the D's on the keys that they're going to play, so that they only have to think about finger 2 hitting that key with the tab on it. They don't have to think about so many things at one time. And then one thing we also like to do with the little ones is, let me get my lion here. Just to motivate them to want to have a loose arm, we often have the lion pretend he's sleeping, and then the student will play a good heavy lion paw drop. And if it's loose and loud, then the lion wakes up and he's really scared. He's like, what was that sound? And then he goes and hides somewhere else. So often they'll be really motivated to wake the lion up, but he only wakes up if they do a correct lion paw that's loose and loud. And that's a fun way to get at it, because when teaching all these techniques, we need to keep it fun so that they'll want to do it the correct way.
You can actually find a video of what Julie is talking about on our website. If you go to videos, choose Repertoire Book 1, and then Lion Paw, you'll see Julie's teaching a student this exercise and doing this very activity with the lion sleeping.
Yeah, it's also on our YouTube channel. I think it's called Working on Lion Paw.
We have another question here. Any hints for teaching animal techniques to new students remotely? And then I'm used to taking students' hands and moving them in the proper way, and I miss doing that during remote teaching. Yes, we all do. I know what you mean. Any tips, Julie? You've been teaching younger students more online than I have recently.
Yeah, actually my youngest one now is in book 2, so I don't have any book 1 students right now, and I would love to have some because the little ones are my favorite, but I've decided not to take any new students until we can meet back in person. But for even my level 2 students, often I'll have them watch the reminder video the week before I introduce it, so they get an idea of what it looks like and start thinking about it, and they can even start trying it on the piano, both the technique and the rote piece. They can watch that reminder video and learn so much just from that. And then it's mostly just a verbal back and forth, and there's only so much you can do remotely, as we've probably all learned. So, I mean, we just have to do the best we can. If they have a parent there, that might be helpful, or it might not, depending on the parent. But I think the more analogies you can make to what it feels like and what it looks like, that would help them also. I found it really helpful to see my students' piano setup at home. Like, I had never seen their pianos before. I started teaching online, so then I can adjust their bench height or their sitting position. And I didn't know one of my students still only has a digital piano. I thought he had. I asked his mom when he started, like, what kind of piano do you have? And she said, we have a Yamaha. And I'm like, great. Well, it was not a Yamaha acoustic piano. It was a Yamaha digital piano. So then I realized that that might be part of why his technique has been a little more difficult to develop. So I'm talking them into getting an acoustic piano now. But I guess I don't have any great tips.
I think just maybe going through, like, planning ahead for lots of steps that you can take to introduce it. Like, so for example, the Lion Paw, one thing that we normally start with is holding the student's arm and letting it flop to the side. A parent would have to be there for that. I mean, you can try to have a student hold their own arm, but usually that's harder. So doing that step until they can drop with weight. And then, like we said, just dropping anywhere with weight on the piano. And just being very strategic about steps that you can take that are very clear, that the student can succeed at before, just teaching them the exact exercise. And of course, another one is listening to the technical exercise first, because we have recordings. They come with the books. In Repertoire Book 1, there's the code in the front, and also in Repertoire Book 2. So students can download and listen to anything that's taught by rote. So if they listen to the technique before coming in, that can be helpful. And then we also have online videos, reminder videos that show the technique. So those are things that can be especially helpful during this time of online teaching. I'm teaching a pedagogy class here, and my pedagogy students had to start a new student in Piano Safari for the first time online. So I've been mentoring them through this, and one thing that I have them do is email the parent after every single lesson, and they include the video links in their email, and as well as remind them to listen to the audio track. So that will help the student be prepared and also reinforce what they learned in the lesson.
Yeah, we're running low on time, but just to finish up a few more questions. Christy asked, how do you speak to transfer students about the need for curved fingertips, which are completely missing, fingers flat while playing? I'm sure we've all had students that have this problem, those pesky collapsed finger joints, or in some cases, students playing flat like this. And it's a process, and sometimes it takes a year or longer before they can reliably play on their fingertips. The biggest thing is to bring them back to playing non-legato. And so often I'll do this with the sight reading cards that are very easy for them, to give them something to concentrate on when they're reading, and then see if they can play it non-legato with good fingertips. And also their pieces too. You can assign them to play non-legato. If they're older, and you can introduce some of the animal techniques without the animal names, just to say, let's just check your hand position. Can you play this? And just do some question and answer playing, so that they can see what yours look like and then play it. And then you can be very picky about, hey, did you see how mine, I was up on every single fingertip, and yours looked like this. It was all flat like a pancake. And then one other thing is just to nag them in a nice way, but just nag them. So if they start playing and they're flat, just stop them right away and say, oops, I think you forgot something. Remember your tall fingertips? And if you stop them every time they start playing and remind them of that, eventually they'll get tired of you stopping them, and they'll try harder to do it the right way. But it does take some gentle nagging over a long period of time.
And I would say, I agree, Julie, non-legato is such a key, because think about how difficult it is to actually play non-legato and keep a flat finger, right? I mean, you can't even hit the note correctly. So I just think the articulation can encourage that.
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we thank all of you for joining us today in our webinar. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can email us at questions@pianosafari.com or info@pianosafari.com, and we'd be happy to answer those. So we hope you all enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a good weekend ahead. And thank you again for your time.
Bye. Thanks for coming.
Bye.